again. I'm Schottelkotte with more great, near great, and not so great moments in Cincinnati's history, including events held to celebrate Cincinnati's Bicentennial. As with our first video edition in 1987, this is not an attempt to chronicle the Queen City's formal history year by year. Rather, it's a look at more of the people and institutions that contributed to the city's rich, absorbing, and sometimes spicy 200-year history. Some of the people were natives of the city. Some moved to Greater Cincinnati from other places. Still others came to visit and made a mark while in residence. Among the latter was a woman whose name became synonymous with the temperance movement at the beginning of this century, Carrie Nation. Carrie had gained her renown by traveling from city to city with a hatchet, smashing and splintering each saloon she encountered. Cincinnati in those days was called the Paris of America because of the rows of saloons and night spots that lined both sides of Vine Street. The two forces were set to collide in 1901 when Carrie announced that she would visit Cincinnati. In anticipation, worried saloon keepers reinforced the glass in their establishments. But Carrie broke no windows on her tour of Vine Street. She claimed she would have died of exhaustion after just one block. As the firebrand headed back to the train depot, she stopped to convert a woman well fortified with the demon rum. The inebriate tearfully hugged Carrie, who then moved on, certain that she had helped yet another poor soul lift herself from the grape-filled gutters. What Carrie didn't realize until she got to the train, the woman, while in embrace, had deftly lifted Carrie's earrings. A Cincinnati native who earned a respected place in American history was Daniel Carter Beard, a co-founder of the Boy Scouts of America. Beard was born in 1850 on West 9th Street, son of a well-known portrait painter. Beard became an excellent surveyor, and he loved the open spaces. He published a book on the outdoors called The American Boy's Handy Book. Its success inspired Beard to decide to spend his life working with boys. He became the first Boy Scout commissioner, a post that he held until his death in 1941. Beard wanted his organization to be open to boys of all races and creeds. As a result, the Scouts were one of the first American institutions to be integrated. Here, a jamboree at the Cincinnati Zoo in the 20s. The Greater Cincinnati Boy Scout Council is named for Beard, as is the I-471 bridge to Newport. Most Americans know that the North won the Civil War, due in large part to its industrial base. But few Cincinnatians are aware their city was the major supplier of weapons and food for the Union forces. Cincinnati's strategic importance is what drew Clermont County native Ulysses S. Grant to call his generals to the city in mid-March of 1864. Grant rented a home on West 8th Street, and he and his aides drew up a plan to end the war. Grant, Sherman, McClellan, Pope, Rosecrans, and Burnside sat around a huge oak table in a conference room at the old Burnett House and conceived a strategy to split the South in half. Their plan would lead to the eventual surrender of Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse a year later. The plan went down in history as Sherman's March to the Sea, which ended with the burning of Atlanta. Even fewer Cincinnatians know that the first military use of aerial vehicles occurred during the Civil War due to the efforts of Thaddeus S.C. Lowe and his Cincinnati connection, Treasury Secretary Salmon P. Chase. 1 week after Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, Lowe took off on a 9-hour, 900-mile balloon trip from Cincinnati to Unionville, South Carolina. He was arrested as a spy the minute that he stepped from the balloon's gondola. After his release, a short time later, Lowe got Chase to arrange a meeting with President Abraham Lincoln. Lowe dramatized the potential strategic use of balloons in warfare by sending a telegram to the president in the White House from a balloon suspended over the Smithsonian Institution. Convinced, Lincoln ordered formation of the Federal Balloon Corps. 2 years later, the balloons hovered behind Union lines in Pennsylvania, high enough to report Confederate troop movements via telegraph to Union generals on the ground. The reports helped the North prevail at the Battle of Gettysburg, one of the most significant Union victories in the Civil War. In our first video edition, we noted a number of firsts for the Queen City. There are many more. Among them, in 1822, Dr. Daniel Drake received a charter for the Cincinnati Commercial Hospital and Lunatic Asylum, the first hospital in the United States developed for the teaching of medicine. In 1896, the Medical College of Ohio and the Commercial Hospital became the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine and General Hospital. 25 years later, General was the largest hospital in the world. General is now University Hospital. The first airmail took off from Cincinnati by hot air balloon on the 4th of July in 1835. History books do not record where the mail was supposed to have gone or where it actually ended up. America's first private observatory was dedicated atop Mount Adams in 1843. UC professor Ormsby McKnight Mitchell had persuaded Cincinnatians to build a bigger observatory than the one the Russians were constructing with heavy taxes levied by the Tsar. Late in the century, when electric lights began illuminating the city, the observatory was forced to move to Mount Lookout. It's still there, and University of Cincinnati astronomy students still use Mitchell's original telescope. In Cincinnati in 1862, the first Gatling guns were produced. The weapons had hand cranks that rotated the barrels and controlled the firing speed. A year earlier, the gun's inventor, Richard Jordan Gatling, had shared his ideas for a rapid-fire gun with Cincinnati's first fire chief, Miles Greenwood. At the time, Greenwood operated one of the country's largest iron foundries and was making rifles and bronze cannon for Union forces in the Civil War. Gatling, who had graduated from the Ohio Medical College in Cincinnati, oversaw production of 6 guns at Greenwood's factory. Before any more could be turned out, a fire destroyed Greenwood's plant, the guns, and the plans to make them. Gatling ended his association with Greenwood, moved on, started over, and patented his gun. The Gatling gun saw widespread use from the end of the Civil War until World War I, when machine guns made it obsolete. It was used to quell the Hamilton County Courthouse riot of 1884. In the 1880s, the first air conditioning was invented at Emerson A. North Hospital in College Hill, then a mental institution for the wealthy. Ice was shipped in by canal and placed in a tower next to the hospital building. Fans blew air across the ice through tunnels under the building. This cold air then entered each room through ducts and forced out hot air, the same way air conditioners do today. In 1896, Cincinnati experienced the world's first sonic boom. It occurred the day the steeple at St. Francis de Sales Church in Walnut Hills was dedicated. The church tower featured the largest free-swinging bell ever cast, called Big Joe. Made at the Van Dusen Foundry in Cincinnati, Big Joe was 7 feet tall, 9 feet wide, and weighed 35,000 pounds. 14 horses were needed to cart the bell from the foundry to the church. 4 men were needed to ring it. Their services were needed only once. When the huge bell was swung to celebrate the steeple's dedication, a boom in the key of E flat broke windows and buildings for blocks around. The bell is still there, but was never swung again. Since that destructive debut, it's been struck with a clapper from the outside. In 1903, America's first concrete skyscraper, the Ingalls Building, was completed at 4th and Vine. Many predicted the 15-story structure would collapse of its own weight. In fact, a newspaper editor stayed up all night in front of the building to get the scoop when it fell down. It's still standing. On April 23, 1923, Cincinnati and Mary Emery turned the first spade of earth to begin construction of the village which bears her name, Marymount. Mrs. Emery is the first and only person in American history to conceive and build a complete town from scratch on land she bought herself. After she acquired the land, she formed a company to build what was intended as a community for lower-income people. It had all the essentials: homes, churches, public buildings, schools, shops, roads, and an industrial park, most of which were completed after her death in 1927. She might have been disappointed in the final product. Marymount was so attractive, it became not a blue-collar community, but an upscale one. On July 31st, 1935, Kitty Burke became the first and only woman to bat in a Major League Baseball game when she went to the plate for the Cincinnati Reds playing St. Louis. Miss Burke, a nightclub entertainer, had been heckling Cardinal left fielder Joe Ducky Medwick, proclaiming loudly that she could hit better than he could. He shouted back a dare to try. She jumped from the stands, grabbed a bat from the Reds' Babe Herman, and stepped to the plate. The umpire signaled, "Play ball." But the pitcher, Daffy Dean, refused. Kitty called him a hick and taunted him to go home and milk the cows. Angered, Dean delivered, and Kitty grounded out to first base. The Cardinals insisted the out count. The umpire said no, and Babe Herman batted after all. Herman did a little better. He hit a sacrifice fly. In 1954, America's first licensed educational television station, WCET, began broadcasting. And in 1972, in ceremonies at the historic Isaac M. Wise Temple on Plum Street, Sally J. Presand was ordained America's first woman rabbi. A truly great moment in Cincinnati history occurred shortly after the Civil War ended. The suspension bridge opened. At the time, it was the longest suspension bridge in the world and still is considered an architectural masterpiece. It had an arduous birth, though. Steamboatmen had opposed an Ohio River bridge at Cincinnati since one first was proposed in 1811. They argued a bridge would block their craft in high water and ruin the city financially. But by mid-century, Amos Schinkel of Covington and a group of Kentucky businessmen wanting direct access to the factories of Cincinnati obtained a bridge charter from the Kentucky legislature. In Columbus, the powerful steamboat lobby worked to get the Ohio legislature to reject a bridge charter for Schinkel's group. The steamboat interests lost the battle, but did gain an interesting concession. Ohio's lawmakers added a codicil that still causes traffic tie-ups today. They prohibited the bridge from ever linking up with an existing Cincinnati street. Since Covington streets lined up exactly with Cincinnati's, that meant the bridge would never be able to connect existing thoroughfares on a straight line. Over the next 10 years, construction was delayed twice. Once during the financial panic of 1857, then during the Civil War. Nevertheless, the suspension bridge unofficially opened December the 1st, 1866, and 46,000 people walked across it. The suspension, a toll bridge until the 1960s, was operated continuously by members of the Schinkel family until 1955, when the bridge company sold it to the state of Kentucky. It's listed on the National Register of Historic Places and remains a monument to the engineering genius of John A. Roebling, after whom the span is now named. The Miami and Erie Canal, one of Cincinnati's first public works projects, also was one of its greatest. The canal opened in 1827 and enabled Cincinnati to position itself as a center of commerce. By mid-century, boats carrying ice, sand, pork, lumber, and other assorted cargo moved up and down the canal. Procter & Gamble, meat packers, distillers, and other businesses moved to locations along the waterway. The Miami and Erie Canal connected the Great Lakes to all ports south, with Cincinnati as the hub. As far as a waterway goes, the canal was small, 4 feet deep and 40 feet wide. Barges 14 feet wide and 78 feet long carried cargo as well as people. Canal boats holding 30 times the load of land wagons were pulled by mules or horses. Toward the end of the century, electric trucks on rail were used to tow the barges. Then locomotives on their own rails made canals obsolete. After World War I, the canal was drained to make way for Cincinnati's ill-fated subway and for Central Parkway. Powell Crosley, a pioneer in broadcasting, a successful appliance manufacturer, and owner of the Cincinnati Reds, realized another dream when he invented America's first compact car, the Crosley. Trouble is, the Crosley was about 40 years ahead of its time. Early models were manufactured at Crosley's Arlington Street radio plant. The first Crosley went on sale in 1939. It was a lightweight, two-cylinder job. It got 50 miles per gallon of gas, achieved a top speed of 50 miles an hour, and cost only $325. Crosley sold his cars through department stores of all places, but he didn't sell enough of them. In 1952, the last Crosley rolled off the assembly line of the plant that he'd built for his budding auto empire in Marion, Indiana. Ambulances were produced for many years by the Cincinnati firm of Hess and Eisenhart, but ambulances certainly were not the most interesting vehicles to come out of its plant. Since the 1930s, the company has done the armor plating for limousines used by presidents of the United States. Hess and Eisenhart, former engineers for General Motors, were approached by President Franklin D. Roosevelt about making his Cadillac a more secure vehicle. They did such a good job, they have been customizing presidential Cadillacs and Lincolns ever since. The customizations included the famous bubble-top limousine in which John Kennedy was riding when he was assassinated in Dallas, riding with the bubble top down so the president could be closer to the people who wanted to run up and shake his hand. A special customization of that car was requested by President Johnson, who used it after JFK's death. He had Hess and Eisenhart place listening devices or bugs on the outside of the car so that he could hear what people were saying about him. These days, trade shows are an integral part of doing business in America and throughout the world. Such trade shows had their roots in the industrial expositions made popular in Cincinnati following the Civil War. Product makers like Christian Moerlein Beer and Cincinnati Milling Machine gained international renown by regularly winning ribbons at these and other industrial expositions. Clifton resident Alfred Goshorn became so efficient at arranging and managing expositions that he was called on to head the Bicentennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876, when America celebrated its 100th birthday. He did such a good job that royalty in many countries wanted to honor him. By a special act of Congress, Goshorn was allowed to be knighted by Queen Victoria. Thus, Sir Alfred Goshorn, native Cincinnatian, became the first, last, and only American ever to become a Knight of the British Empire. Not many businesses which were household names a century ago still exist in Cincinnati, but some do. In gathering material for this project, we found a number of old advertisements for firms which are still around. You might find it interesting to see the way they advertised themselves 3 generations ago. When commercial radio arrived, several Cincinnati businesses were quick to take advantage of the new advertising medium. Here are a few of the ads for those companies and the programs they sponsored.
The Jurgens Journal, featuring Walter Winchell, America's one-man newspaper. His famous column appears in the New York Daily Mirror and over 725 other newspapers, from New York to Shanghai, China. And now to the editorial room of the Jurgen Journal and Walter Winchell.
Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. North and South America, and all the ships and clippers at sea. Let's go to press. Flash, London. The terms of surrender for the Italian army in Ethiopia have just been handed to Mussolini's representatives.
Everybody ready for Occidental's own Ma Perkins, America's mother of the air. Brought to you by Procter & Gamble, makers of Occidental.
The guiding light. Brought to you by the makers of P&G soap.
Perhaps the most famous theater in Cincinnati history, the National, opened in 1837 on Sycamore between 3rd and 4th. For 50 years, the National featured the greatest acts in show business, including Shakespeare by Edwin Booth and arias by the great Jenny Lind. Delirious fans bought her gloves, laces, and ribbons at an auction for charity, and a leading citizen bought the piano she played. The National's popularity declined in the 1880s when it became a tobacco warehouse. It was torn down in 1940. The most ornate downtown theater in this century, if not the best known, was the Albee. The fancy Rococo Auditorium opened its 30 doors on Christmas Eve in 1927. Hy Geis and his mighty Wurlitzer in the pit accompanied Clara Bow's antics in Get Your Man on the screen. The history books record that the Albee officially closed on September 17, 1974, and was torn down in March of 1977. The last performance at the theater actually took place the day before it fell victim to the Wreckers' Ball. The green marble ticket booth was gone, the bronze filigree and plaster decorations were chipped and fading, and the proscenium and lavish boxes tattered, as Bill Rank slowly walked onto the stage with his trombone. Rank, in his 80s, had played the famous showplace in the 20s with the Paul Whiteman Orchestra, and he wanted the honor of being the last person to perform at the Albee. On that March Sunday, there was no longer any heat or electricity in the theater. It was dark, chilly, and damp, as Rank nervously raised the trombone to his lips. Then, Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue echoed forth through the deserted halls of the once proud theater one last time. The Albee was torn down the next day. Rank died just a few months later. Cincinnati, over the years, has produced its share of composers, writers, and artists. Stephen Foster, for example, spent the happiest and most productive years of his short life in Cincinnati. He worked as a clerk at his brother's firm, Irwin and Foster, steamboat agents. There he wrote a number of his most famous songs, including Oh, Susanna. The song became nationally famous as the anthem of the men and women called 49ers, who took it with them from Cincinnati to the gold fields of California in the mid-1800s. Harriet Beecher Stowe based her famous book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, on the people and events she experienced while living in Cincinnati. Here she lived with her father, the famous preacher Lyman Beecher, who ran the Lane Theological Seminary in Walnut Hills. In Cincinnati, she married a theologian who taught at Lane, Calvin Stowe, and bore him 6 children. When her youngest died of cholera in 1849, she felt a sorrow akin to that of slave women who had their children taken from them. The experience inspired her to write her novel of life in slavery, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which became one of the most effective forces for winning support for the anti-slavery movement. Lafcadio Hearn, when a young Cincinnati journalist in the mid-1800s, was noted for his sensational accounts of murders and poverty along Cincinnati's riverfront. He was an inventive man. One day, shortly after St. Peter and Chains Cathedral was completed in the 1850s, the reporter convinced a steeplejack to carry Hearn on his shoulders to the top of the steeple. Hearn wanted to write a bird's-eye account of what the city looked like from such an incredible height. The steeplejack obliged. That his report seemed accurate in almost every detail was, in itself, a tribute to Hearn's talent. As readers later learned, Hearn was nearsighted and hadn't really seen a thing from up on the steeple. He'd made up the entire account. One day, Hearn talked his editor into giving him the money to travel to New Orleans to report on life there. He never returned. Later, Hearn achieved world renown for his novels and eclectic writings on subjects ranging from life in the West Indies to Buddhism to anti-Semitism in Russia and France. He obtained a teaching position in Japan, married a Japanese woman of a samurai family, and gave Western readers their first sympathetic view of Japanese life. Hearn became a Japanese citizen, took the name Koizumi Yakumo, and taught at the Imperial University in Tokyo from 1896 to 1903. Another Cincinnatian who gained fame in the newspaper business is best remembered for the motto he coined to help save a dying daily that he bought in New York. Adolph Oakes and his wife Effie, daughter of Cincinnati's noted Rabbi Isaac M. Wise, moved to New York, where he rescued the all but moribund New York Times. He changed the daily's publishing philosophy and vowed to readers that his Times would forever contain all the news that's fit to print. Under Oakes' leadership, the New York Times became one of the world's premier newspapers. A great moment in Cincinnati history occurred in 1886, when the Art Palace of the West debuted on 20 acres in Eden Park. The Art Academy opened the following year. Citizens could view with wonder artistic treasures ranging from a bust of George Washington to copies of the great paintings of the world. In later years, new wings were added to close the gap between the exhibition building and the Art Academy, where Frank Duveneck taught. Duveneck, actually a native of Covington, became one of America's great painters. John Singer Sargent called Duveneck the most talented painter of his generation. Duveneck spent considerable time teaching and painting in Europe, enhancing his reputation internationally. After his wife's death in 1888, Duveneck returned to Cincinnati and taught at the Art Academy until his death in 1919. Other well-known Cincinnati artists were contemporaries of Duveneck. Included were Edward Pothast, John Twachtman, John Rettig, and Henry Farney. Farney became perhaps the most prominent. He was a bit of a free spirit, best known for his paintings of American Indians. He loved painting in the West, and he spent a great deal of time doing so. To subsidize his Western ventures, Farney did illustrations for magazines. He also painted nudes for bars, bordellos, and assignation houses. He could finish these risque works in about 20 minutes. The pay, he told friends, was excellent. There were those inevitable, not-so-great moments in the Cincinnati of a century ago. The rough-and-tumble town was the gateway to the Wild West. Murders were daily occurrences, grisly crimes were not uncommon, and a red-light district flourished. Keelboat operators were the wildest and toughest frontiersmen, and Mike Fink was the most legendary keeler of all. Once, the story goes, he set fire to his woman to caution her against infidelity. After the Civil War, grave robbing was common. On one occasion, physician Joseph McDowell returned to Cincinnati College with the corpse of a young girl who had died of a particularly puzzling disease. A moment later, the girl's family stormed the building with pistols and a hanging rope. The desperate doctor threw himself on the dissecting table, pulled a sheet over his head, held his breath, and pretended he was dead. He got away with it. A decade later, the public was outraged by the murder of an Avondale family. Two men admitted they had killed the family so they could sell the corpses to a doctor at the Medical College of Ohio. The doctor's indifference to the way in which his cadavers met their ends raised the cry that he encouraged murder. This crime came at a time when jails were crowded with convicted murderers and prompted the Cincinnati Enquirer to publish a breast-thumping article under the headline, College of Murder. The crimes and subsequent public outcry helped incite the passions that led to the famous courthouse riot of 1884. Cincinnati's celebrated Tenderloin District centered on George Street, a short east-west thoroughfare between West 6th and 7th until World War I. The 3 blocks between Mound and Central were lined with solid brick houses whose red lights advertised the wicked pleasures that awaited within. Quiet during the day, George Street sang a litany to Venery at night. Inside the neat, well-kept bordellos, the madams smiled briskly, black orchestras made music, and a procession of men entered doors bearing bright signs with girls' names on them. Once, a beautiful, demure young woman entered one of Cincinnati's female seminaries as a student and was soon discovered to be the operator of a George Street bordello. Her intention to secure recruits led to immediate dismissal. Regulation came at the turn of the century, but George Street's temples of love carried on until World War I days. That's when the War Department ordered the brothels closed. The plush chairs, ornate beds, lavish draperies, and colored chandeliers turned up in second-hand shops. And the girls turned up, appropriately enough, on John Street. One of the most bizarre Cincinnati crime stories of modern times was the murder of Louise Bergen and the conviction of Edith Klump. Mrs. Klump was found guilty of the 1958 shooting of Mrs. Bergen, the wife in a love triangle. The slaying took place in Hartwell, and the body was taken in a car trunk to Cowan Lake, where it was burned. Mrs. Klump maintained her innocence, claiming the shooting was accidental. She repeatedly sought clemency from Ohio Governor Michael DeSalle, an outspoken opponent of the death penalty. In 1961, the day before she was to die, DeSalle went to Marysville Prison to have Mrs. Klump given a truth serum. She continued to deny guilt, and at midnight, the governor commuted her sentence to life in prison. The case became a major issue in the 1962 Ohio gubernatorial race, and Democrat DeSalle lost his bid for re-election to Republican James Rhodes. On DeSalle's last day in office, January 15, 1963, he reduced Mrs. Klump's sentence even further, from first-degree murder to second-degree, making her eligible for parole. She was released from prison after serving 11 and a half years. One man who constantly won re-election was Nicholas Longworth, a descendant of the famed Cincinnati vintner Nicholas Longworth, and one of the most powerful politicians Cincinnati ever produced. He was Speaker of the U.S. House during the 1920s and controlled Congress like few men ever did. He was popular, a good speaker, and had married Alice Roosevelt, the famous daughter of President Theodore Roosevelt. Longworth was the leader of the conservative wing of the Republican Party and was faced with an interesting choice during the 1912 presidential campaign. Should he support his friend and longtime political mentor, incumbent President William Howard Taft, or his father-in-law, Teddy Roosevelt? The loyal Longworth supported Taft, who more clearly represented Longworth's conservative beliefs. But the two candidates split the vote and lost to Democrat Woodrow Wilson. Longworth died in 1931. His funeral, attended by President Herbert Hoover and other dignitaries, was one of the largest in Cincinnati's history. As we mentioned in our first video, Cincinnati was home to 3 men who made it to the White House. In a tenuous way, the city can claim 2 others who became president. The first was Ulysses S. Grant, who was born in Clermont County, but often traveled to Cincinnati as a youth to conduct business, and who lived here for a time during the Civil War. The second was Benjamin Harrison, grandson of President William Henry Harrison. Benjamin Harrison was born in the Cincinnati suburb of North Bend, but he spent more time in Indianapolis and is more often thought of as an Indiana president. At one time, a man who later became president owned land here, land he never saw, and land he couldn't sell. George Washington acquired 3 plots just east of the Little Miami River, covering more than 3,000 acres. They were listed in his will as being worth $15,000. Washington never visited his land, and in 1796 had advertised it for sale. His newspaper ad read in part, "Being in the neighborhood of Cincinnati and Fort Washington, they cannot, from their situation, if the quality of the soil is correctly stated, be otherwise than valuable." Maybe, but nobody bought it. Later surveys ignored Washington's title, and the land was taken over by others. But Mount Washington retains the name of the man who once owned it. Throughout the years, many presidents have visited Cincinnati. Some, like Warren Harding here, slipped in, made their appearances, and left. Others, like Gerald Ford, drew large crowds to hear them speak. Presidential candidates also have drawn large crowds, and the visits of some of them were memorable. One was the stop by Abraham Lincoln, who passed through the Queen City on February 12, 1861, his birthday. He was on his way to Washington to be inaugurated. Lincoln spoke from a balcony on 5th Street, and for the most part was cheered, but a large crowd of Southern sympathizers heckled Mr. Lincoln as he spoke. In 1960, unprecedented numbers of people in this Republican bastion turned out to welcome the charismatic young Democrat, Senator John F. Kennedy. He spoke on Fountain Square and drew some laughs when he mispronounced the Queen City's name, calling it Cincinnati. Someone briefed him on the correct pronunciation, and he got it right in a speech later that night at the old Gibson Hotel. Cincinnatians have always loved a parade. Take, for example, this GAR March. The former Union soldiers were encamped in Cincinnati for a reunion, as was their custom, and climaxed the get-together with a parade. It took place in the early 30s and was billed as the last encampment to be held, since most of those attending were in their 70s and 80s. That didn't keep one aging vet from doing an impromptu dance. One spectator, a Hamilton County judge, looked more presidential than judicial. Ticker tape parades were held to celebrate the ends of both world wars, and marches have regularly been a part of most special occasions in Cincinnati. The Findlay Market Opening Day Parade has been a part of the rites of spring in Cincinnati, kicking off the baseball season and inspiring optimism in local fans for more than half a century. The Holy Name Parade was a monstrous annual event thanks to Roman Catholic Archbishop Henry Moeller. He appointed the Reverend Joseph Shea to head the Holy Name Union, which held its first huge parade in 1912. 25,000 Cincinnati Catholics marched in that parade to publicly affirm their faith. The annual parades grew in size, reaching a peak in 1934 when an estimated 250,000 Cincinnatians either marched or watched along the way or waited at Crosley Field where a solemn benediction took place. Every now and then, a guest of honor, like former presidential candidate Al Smith, would appear. The election of John Kennedy as the first Catholic president in 1960 and the Second Vatican Council a short time later led Catholic leaders to believe there was no longer a need for such public affirmations of faith. The parades were discontinued. The last Holy Name Parade took place in 1962. Another tradition carried on for more than a century is the praying of the steps on Mount Adams on Good Friday. No one knows with certainty how the tradition got started, But one story has it that the practice was begun by shepherds shortly after Immaculata Church was built in the middle of the last century. The shepherds gathered the sheep that grazed on the hillside below the church and walked with them up the hill to the church to pray. In the years that followed, neighbors would join the shepherds, and soon Catholics from all over the archdiocese took part in the ritual. Steamboats have always been a part of the fabric of Cincinnati. Even today, it is the only American city that is the official home port to overnight passenger steamers, the Mississippi Queen and the Delta Queen, although company offices have moved to New Orleans. Steamboat racing historically was an exciting part of river lore. The last time the Delta Queen and Mississippi Queen raced into Cincinnati, the newer boat won. In the early 1800s, the fastest steamers got the most lucrative contracts to haul freight. Boats raced to see which was speediest. Early in this century, races were held more for fun than for profit. The real prize was bragging rights to river supremacy. One of the interesting tales of steamboat racing came in 1928. On a spring day that year, a reporter from the old Cincinnati Times-Star newspaper happened to be at the scene along the river when Cincinnati's prized packet, the Chris Green, had an informal, unscheduled bragging rights race against the Betsy Ann of Pittsburgh. There was even a mid-river ramming as the crafts jockeyed for position. The reporter rushed back to his newsroom and wrote a stirring account of the riverboat duel. The Associated Press wire service carried the story to papers all over America. Unfortunately, almost every fact in the story was wrong, including where the race ended, how fast the boats went, and even who had won. Tom Green, captain of the Chris Green, knew that his boat had finished in front. He complained to the Times-Star. The paper suggested a rematch between the Chris Green and the Betsy Ann, racing from the foot of Broadway in Cincinnati to New Richmond. On July 24, 1928, thousands lined the Ohio for the second encounter. The Chris Green won again. The two boats raced twice more in ensuing years before they took their places in the history books. One of the great institutions in Cincinnati almost became a not-so-great one, the Zoological Gardens. On September the 18th, 1875, Cincinnati joined Philadelphia as the only American cities with zoos. When it opened, the Cincinnati Zoo featured an elephant, rabbits, monkeys, a lioness, some deer, and a talking crow. Not long after, bear pits were added, and buildings were constructed in the architecture of the native lands of the animals they were to house. But financial troubles constantly plagued the zoo. In 1898, the zoo went into receivership. A citizens committee saved the animals, and in 1901, the Cincinnati Traction Company took over the zoo with promises to keep it solvent. By 1917, however, the zoo's finances were so bleak that the animals actually were put up for sale. Once again, the zoo was rescued. But two of the zoo's principal saviors, Mrs. Charles P. Taft and Mrs. Thomas J. Emery, died during the Depression. Talk circulated about selling the animals and subdividing the zoo into residential property. Strong citizen objections pressured the city into taking over the zoo finally. In the 1970s, the sterile cages of days gone by were replaced by simulated habitats. Breeding programs were refined, and Cincinnati soon developed an international reputation for having the world's sexiest zoo. During the 70s, the zoo added America's first insect world. Each year, entomologists traveled to Trinidad to capture Hercules beetles and other assorted creatures to populate this popular exhibit. They also managed to secure a few fruit bats along the way, but they leave the huge half-ton leatherback turtles right where they are. In 1988, the main attraction at the zoo was a visitor, a giant panda, on loan from a zoo in Mexico. Chester Park on Spring Grove Avenue was opened in 1875, the same year as the zoo. Its owner, George N. Stone, named it after his favorite racehorse, Lady Chester. During the 1870s and 1880s, Chester Park featured racing and was headquarters of the Queen City Jockey Club. It also was the scene of bare-knuckle boxing champion John L. Sullivan's famed victory over Dan McCaffrey of Pittsburgh. Bathing beauty contests drew crowds in the 20s when Grand Opera also came to the park. Hilarity Hall was a popular amusement arcade, and a midway divided the park's huge lake to keep boaters from clobbering swimmers. The park's skating rink was one of the most popular places in Cincinnati. The favorite rides were the Shoot the Chutes, and a ride that debuted in the 1890s was popular at Coney Island until it closed and is still popular with youngsters and adults alike at Kings Island, the Dodgems. When Prohibition came, a ceremonial last keg of real beer was buried in the park. Chester Park's star began to fade as the Depression took hold and Coney Island's popularity grew. Chester Park was forced to close in 1932 because of an unpaid water bill. For more than a century, one of the Queen City's greatest entertainment attractions has been the Cincinnati Reds. The city proudly proclaims itself the birthplace of professional baseball and exalts in the fact that the 1869 Reds went undefeated, winning 68 ball games. But most modern-day Reds fans are astounded to learn that in this bastion of the National League, the American League was born in 1893. The idea for a new league to rival the established National League came about in an old Vine Street drinking establishment, the 10-Minute Club. Two regular patrons of the saloon were responsible. One was the manager of the Reds, the other his friend, a sports writer for Murat Halstead's old Cincinnati commercial newspaper. The two worked for the next few years at reviving the defunct Western League and finding the money to upgrade it into a major league. They succeeded, and in 1901 renamed the Western the American League. Who were the two? The one who had been the Reds' manager, Charles Comiskey, entered the new league with a team from Chicago called the White Sox. The other fellow, the sports writer, was Ban Johnson, and he became the first president of the American League. Sadly, the two became bitter enemies in the years that followed, so much so that during the World Series of 1919, Johnson refused to help Comiskey investigate his suspicions that his White Sox players were taking bribes to throw the World Series to the Cincinnati Reds. Of course, everyone who has ever lived in Cincinnati has heard of the Cincinnati Reds. But few remember there once was a team in the National Football League called the Cincinnati Reds. Its obscurity is not surprising. The team was entirely forgettable. The Football Reds entered the league in 1933 and finished fourth in the five-team Western Division, won that year by the Chicago Bears, featuring the legendary Red Grange. The next year, the Football Reds lost their first 8 games, scoring a grand total of 10 points and giving up 243. After that 8th straight loss, the Reds were thrown out of the NFL for non-payment of league dues. It's just as well. The last game they played was a 64-0 loss to the Philadelphia Eagles, who managed to score only 127 points all year. One of the great human interest stories in Cincinnati history involves two men who were stars on the 1958 Cincinnati Royals of the National Basketball Association, Maurice Stokes and Jack Twyman. Flying home after the last playoff game in Detroit that year, Stokes fell into a deep coma and virtual paralysis. His family lived in Pennsylvania, so teammate Twyman became his legal guardian. During the years that followed, with Twyman constantly at his side, encouraging him through grueling therapy and rehabilitation, Stokes regained partial use of his limbs and learned to make some sounds. Twyman found ways to raise thousands of dollars to help defray Stokes' enormous medical bills. He organized charity basketball games featuring NBA stars and worked devotedly with and for his helpless friend until Stokes died in 1970. Hollywood made the stirring story of the relationship between the two men into a movie titled Big Mo. Now it's time to wrap up our second volume of the great, near great, and not so great moments in Cincinnati history. What better way to end this celebration of the city's bicentennial than to look back at the events which all enjoyed during the Queen City's year-long 200th birthday party.
It was a terrific time for me. My brothers and I were singing on the radio on WLW in the morning. Then I went to school, where I promptly fell in love with a girl who was much older than I was. She was a senior and I was a freshman.
Well, I was the voice of the Reds between 1971 and 1973. It was the formative stage of the Big Red Machine. It was a chance for me to do Major League Baseball at a very early age, so the city was a great springboard for me.
We played against each other. In fact, my dream was to play in Cincinnati because I grew up here. My roots are here. And unfortunately, we played the Bengals twice in Dallas, but fortunately we won. And Ken...
You did not win. You annihilated us. I mean, it wasn't close both times.